Welcome back to the Metal Exchange. Justin and Chris here with you for another week. My friend, you are back in the United States. How was your trip?
Oh, it was really nice. It was nice to get away. It was like the first proper vacation that we've had in a long time. So just a whole week of Caribbean excursions and good food and lots of activities and sitting in the sun and and most importantly not doing any work.
It's a beautiful thing. Was this your first time in the Caribbean, or had you been there before?
I've been to Puerto Rico before, but that was pretty much it. And that was back when I was a teenager, probably before I even owned Land of the Free, honestly.
Oh, there you go. I like the segue. Nice. Well, welcome back. I have a feeling that you probably didn't have a chance to listen to very much this week. And I'll be honest with you, I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that really popped for me. That stuff that one album that came out and a single that came out that were both really, really interesting to me. The first album that I wanted to talk about was a Greek band called Doomocracy, and the album, or I should say the band name, is so ridiculous. The album is called Unorthodox, but I have to say, for doom metal, I thought it was really, really, really well done. They're from the island of Crete, and I actually have a friend that was from that island, although I don't think she listens to Doomocracy, if I had to bet. But the album was just really, really well done, quality doom. And a band that I think has released a couple of albums previously, but I had never heard of them before. So that's good stuff. I'll post something of theirs this week. And a single that came out that I have never heard of these guys, but our friends over at the MSR Cast mentioned this band on their latest podcast, and I got to hear something by them. The song is called The Malevolent God. The band is called In the Woods. And they are I believe, a Norwegian band. And they kind of started as a black metal band, and then they went a little bit avant-garde proggy. This single has a little bit of everything. Their album Diversum, I think, comes out next month. No, or actually at the end of this month, I think November 25th. This is really interesting stuff. And as I've mentioned 1,000 times before on the podcast, my tastes have been changing a little bit. So while Land of the Free was a complete nostalgia trip for me, and I obviously thoroughly enjoyed going back and listening to it, I didn't want to listen to power metal this week when I was devoting so much time to Land of the Free. So finding a band like In the Woods was just a real, I don't know, a nice juxtaposition to what I was otherwise listening to back in the late 90s or whatever. And then this week. So really, really interesting stuff. I'm definitely going to check out this album towards the end of the month. And who knows, maybe it'll even rank on the top 25, the top 50 list if I give it enough time. I'm just kind of curious to see where it goes. My list is kind of taking shape at this point. I'm sure things will kind of come in and out in certain spots, but for the most part, a lot of it has been solidified with 6 weeks left in the year. It's crazy where the year has gone. But I'll play both of these, and I think you'll enjoy hearing them for what they are.
Cool. Yeah, I always look forward to hearing something a little bit different. And good Lord, I definitely need to do some work on my list. It's 6 weeks. That just really crept up, and I feel like I don't have as good of a grasp on my favorite albums this year that I did last year. It just seemed a lot more tangible, I guess, for lack of a better term. Last year, this year, I don't really feel like I have a runaway number one. I'm definitely going to have to go back and re-listen to a lot of stuff. I don't know that I have too much more that I'm excited about that isn't out yet, but I could just be forgetting, so...
I feel like a lot came out in the last 2 months. And then even when you take a look back at the whole year, at least for my money, it was a lot of good stuff, but not a lot of 10 out of 10, like, classic albums that are going to resonate for years to come. There are a handful, but, for the most part, it's deciphering a lot of good stuff, not a lot of great stuff. And so it's very hard to come up with a list when there's not that many standout albums. But by the same token, as much as I'll say it was a weak year, it really wasn't. There were a lot of good releases. There weren't a ton of great releases, if that makes sense. I thought there was a lot
of a lot of 8s, but not very many 9s. And
yes, 10s. Yes. I think that's exactly right. A lot of stuff.
I mean, I remember last year, and maybe you can agree or disagree, but when I've heard the new Halloween album, it was pretty much like I knew at that point, like, so that something would have to be absolutely out of this world to make this not my number one album of the year. And that album came out in the first half of the year, so like that one just kind of sat at the top of the list for the whole year. And I wasn't honestly super surprised that you had chosen that as your album of the year as well.
No, it was pretty clear to me, but by the same token, there were about a half dozen other albums that came out where I just knew, I'm like, this is top 10 material. I keep going back to it. I'm listening to it over and over again. And although some of those albums are albums that I don't think you would have touched with a 10-foot pole, like Sleep Token, Spirit Box maybe, I just love them. And even like Temple Balls and Crown, those albums I just listened to over and over again. And I didn't have that love affair with much of the stuff this year. I mean, there's stuff that I listened to a lot, but for some reason, it just didn't grab me the way some of those albums did. But, and I'll say this, I think if you take a random album that may be 48th on a particular list on a given day, there's an argument to be made that the 48th best album this year was better than the 48th best album last year. It was just a deeper year, just not as top heavy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It might be the post-COVID slump.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the creative juices were coming out 2020, 2021, and now it's kind of like the hangover effect in many cases. Plus, a lot of bands are out there touring because it's time to make some money again. We'll get to it at the end of the show. I mean, a lot of bands have been announced for 70K, and there's other tours that have been announced as well. And it makes sense, right? It's time to go back out and really make some money because the studio albums only draw so much. It just enables you to go out and do another touring cycle for many of these bands.
Yeah, well, I as you surmised, you were correct. I did not listen to anything on this trip until the flight home yesterday. I listened to Land of the Free just to, give myself one quick refresh on an album I've heard many, many times and probably could have done this episode without listening to it at all, but I didn't want to do that, and it was kind of cool listening to this like in midair.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I kind of stuck to podcasts while I was away, and I don't think anything really came out anyway. The only thing that came across my email was that the new Epica EP with all of the guests dropped, and I've heard the first 2 singles. I've yet to hear the other 5 songs. I'm looking forward to particularly the track with Charlotte Wessels, and I know there's another track with Tommy from Camelot and Seventh Wonder. So I'll definitely report back on our next episode on that. But that was pretty much it. It was a good week to just not be present in the world. So.
Sometimes, like musically, I need a week like that, almost like a palate cleanser, where I don't listen to anything for a few days or even a week, other than, of course, what we're covering. But then what I find myself doing is once I have that little cleanse, I go back and I'm like finding real enjoyment out of the stuff that I listened to that following week. It was almost like the time apart brings me closer to the music in many ways. I listened to some really random stuff this week. I found myself listening to a lot of Pink Cream 69. I don't even know why, but I went back down that rabbit hole and I listened to a couple of their albums. Kind of a band that's been lost to time at this point. It was just random stuff that I was playing. And then in addition to that Democracy album that really kind of hit me. But we'll see. It's 6 weeks left. The list will come together, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, either at the end of the year or the beginning of next year, once we've had a chance to compile these lists. But I just get this sense that, like, I don't know that I feel as strongly about the list as I did last year, insofar as you could take album 23 and album 46 and switch them, and I'd probably be completely fine with it, because in my mind, they're probably both 7.75s, if that makes sense.
Right.
It's really
it's
just
like
a matter of
it's like having a 20-way tie.
Yeah. And so I think depending on mood, if I'm in the mood for prog, a certain album may rank a little higher. Or if I'm in the mood for something a little heavier, doomy, deathy, whatever the case may be, albums will move based on my mood. So we'll see where the last 2 weeks of December take us. If I'm depending on my mood, that may dictate how the final list turns out, just in
Yeah,
terms of number.
that to me is the most difficult part, is like taking an album that might be like an 8.5 that's a prog metal album, and an album that might be an 8.5 that's a power metal album, and deciding like which one is for you the better option. It's hard to do. Sometimes you just have to kind of flip a coin and just let the gods decide, if you will.
Yes, I agree, and no better time than transitioning to "Gods of Deliverance" on this album, "Land of the Free," an album that is an absolute classic from 1995. It comes out May 29th of that year. We had talked about the follow-up album, "Somewhere Out in Space," back in the archives. Gosh, it's got to be over a year ago now, maybe a year and a half ago. I'm not sure, but that album we got really did a deep dive into the band and everything else. You had rated that album about a 9.375. I know you are a big fan of that album. I had rated it an 8.75, and I think it might be their most complete album, if you will. I don't know that there's a single song on there that I would want to replace. This album was really the transitional album for the band, though. Kai Hansen steps back up to the plate and does full vocals on the album, whereas on the prior three, Ralph Scheepers, now of Primal Fear, had been kind of behind the mic stand. On this album, though, for whatever reason, they kind of go full on power metal. They move away from kind of the more melodic style, and this is just a power metal classic, very much in the vein of some of that older Helloween stuff, in my opinion. Why did you choose this one, and why now?
Well, part of it was that I wanted something easy while I was while I was away, because I just knew I wasn't going to be able to really get into something new that would really require my full attention. So part of it was that selfish choice. But the other reason was just because, all right, I think there's at least, I would say there's going to be 3 Gamma Ray albums that we really need to talk about. And we've talked about one. This one would be the next one. And then, as I kind of alluded to last week, Power Plant, which was the follow-up to Somewhere Out in Space, would be the third. And I consider that like to me, that's like the Gamma Ray, like classic trilogy of albums. At least for me, I think it might be something that is based on time and nostalgia, because that was around the time that I got into the band. But I also think that like, objectively, that it's their 3 best albums. And maybe somebody else might disagree. Maybe somebody really liked those first 3 albums with Ralph Scheepers that kind of had a little bit more of I thought it had a little bit more of a primitive sound as far as the production goes. I thought that like the production really amped up on Land of the Free. And like you said, it's also like a transitional album for the band, with Kai returning to vocals for the first time, full time, since Walls of Jericho with Helloween. And also it kind of marks the last of like the Gamma Ray was kind of going through like a album by album lineup reshuffling. And when we talk about Somewhere Out in Space, a year ago, that lineup was what would go on to stick for a while. It was probably Gamma Ray's longest tenured lineup. So, at this point, Kai Hansen and Dirk Schlachter are still in the band, but they would be the only ones left come Somewhere Out in Space. Jan Rubach, the bass player, and Thomas Knock, the drummer, would both end up leaving and getting replaced by Henjo Richter on guitar, which would move Dirk to bass. Dirk was the guitarist on this album. He would switch over to bass, which you don't really see a ton of it. And when you go over band histories, a band member going from guitar to bass or vice versa, which I thought was kind of an interesting lineup change. And then Dan Zimmerman would join the band as drummer. Mike's still looking for that autograph for his box set. Shout out to Dan Zimmerman and Snowdy. All that aside, this was the first Gamma Ray album I ever heard, and I got to give props to Pat, who suggested very loudly to me, as only Pat can, that this was something. Oh, Siri was interrupting. That this was something that I needed to hear. And it was funny because, Ralph, who was kind of our direct conduit to metal at this point, he didn't like Gamma Ray, and I always thought that was interesting. And when I asked why, he said that he had the first Iron Savior album and he didn't think it was that good, and that was his reasoning for not really diving into Gamma Ray. So like they were kind of a band that we discovered a bit later than Helloween and Stratovarius and Angra and some of those like really heavy hitter power metal bands from the 90s. And so, on a whim, I bought this album, and I just remember that you and Nick in particular, like, flipped out. Like, when you heard this, like, I when I listen to Rebellion in Dreamland, I think of Nick immediately. I just remember how much he loved this album in particular, but just really glommed onto Gamma Ray, and he would start telling us that he thought Gamma Ray was better than Helloween, and I was like, all right, let's calm down.
Slow down.
I still think about the two of you a lot when I hear this album, but I remember wanting to get the Alive 95 live album that came out shortly after this because there were Helloween covers on it. I mean, but this was like a real game changer, I think. I don't know, it was probably in 97 or 98 that I got it. And then I remember, and I'm sure I told the story, Pat got me a copy of Somewhere Out in Space, which he gave to Ralph, who then gave it to me the first, before homeroom in school one day. And it was like killing me that this album was just sitting in my locker for the whole day and I couldn't listen to it. It's hard to have patience when you're 16, 17 years old. But so like for all those many reasons, I thought that this was just one of those, you like to use the word seminal. It's one of those seminal albums that I think just needs to be included in any collection of discussion on any metal album.
I think we obviously will at some point get to Power Plant, which is the third of the triad, if you will. Everything after that, I literally don't listen to. I have there may be a song or two on each album that I kind of liked. I've listened to them all. I just don't care for it. It's not me. It was like almost like all the creative juices just exploded on Power Plant and the prior albums, and that was it. I do think it would be interesting to do one of the Sheepers albums.
Absolutely.
I know when we spoke to Carl Cadden James offline, he was a huge fan of that stuff, and it was interesting to me because those first three albums, I think, are a little bit unbalanced. They have some phenomenal tracks and then some other tracks which are maybe not as catchy in certain ways. But I do think that it is a very interesting time for the band and is definitely worthy of a discussion. Perhaps the hardest part would be choosing one of the three because I don't know that one of the three stand out, but that is a discussion for
I think
day.
Insanity and Genius is typically considered the strongest of the three. I mean, I never really, I don't know that I know any of those three albums start to finish well, but thanks to that Blast from the Past, I think was the name of the album. Was that right? From 2000? Yeah. Gamma Ray did they actually re-recorded a bunch of their best songs. It might have been fan voted. I don't remember for sure. But I remember the first single that they released, or I don't know if it was a single, but it was just the first song that kind of appeared online was Heaven Can Wait. And I remember being absolutely blown away by it. I was like, I have to buy this set of songs, even though half of them are songs I already have. But I was just like, oh man, I got to hear some of these older songs done, in a modernized way. And that song just blew my socks off. So, there are a lot of really good tunes from that era. Kind of going back to your comment about like post Power Plant. Yeah, like I remember when No World Order came out, like a lot of people kind of called it like their Judas Priest tribute, in that it was a little less like straight up Halloween style power metal and a little bit more kind of traditional heavy metal. And there's some songs on there that I really, really like a lot, but then there's some other songs that I just thought were just okay. And I kind of feel like that's kind of the pattern that Gamma Ray continued on after that. I remember liking Land of the Free Part 2 a bit, but it just didn't. It was again around that time where everyone was sequeling. It was like, The Keeper of the Seven Keys, The Legacy, and like Royal Hunt made Paradox 2, and it's like, we didn't really need you to do that. Like leave the past in the past. Like the entertainment industry is so guilty of that now, of just constantly remaking everything. Or rebooting, or and sometimes it works. See Cobra Kai, and other times, it doesn't work. And I would venture to say that more times than not, it doesn't. It's not a home run, and it was not in these cases. And Land of the Free Part 2 has a song on it called Rain that I think is absolutely fantastic. But if you put a gun to my head, I'm not sure I can remember the name of any other songs that were on that album. Right. I remember enjoying it just fine, but these 3 albums to me were just like the epitome of, and again, it could just be a nostalgia thing, because I also think of like Holy Land and Angels Cry and Fireworks as a trilogy of albums around that same time, and Master of the Rings and Time of the Oath and Better Than Raw, another trilogy from that time. Fourth Dimension Episode and Visions, or Episode Visions and Destiny, depending on how you feel. Like I feel like all these power metal bands had this the 90s trilogy of albums, and Gamma Ray was no exception.
I'm so happy you mentioned that, because one of the questions I was going to ask, and I'll just put it out there now as kind of food for thought. When you think of this album, right, and this time period for the band, I would be curious to put this album and this period up against that Angra trilogy, Labyrinth's Return to Heaven Denied, Blind Guardians, Nightfall and Middle Earth. All of this stuff was coming out within 2 or 3 years of each other. And that's why I'll say it's again, for my money, the unquestionable heyday of power metal. And since then, it's
the golden era.
The golden era. And again, I know we're showing our age, but listen to these albums and then listen to virtually any power metal album that's come out since then. I mean, I think the record speaks for itself. But when you look at those quintessential power metal albums that were coming out around this time, it's hard to pick a favorite, because they were all so special. But and maybe it's a matter of mood, but I think we had rated Angels Cry damn near close to a 10. That might be the pinnacle, but this is not far off.
Agreed. And even like the newer bands in the late 90s, like a Sonata Arctica with Ecliptica. And again, like we cover a lot of the albums we just mentioned or have been covered. And the only reason some of them haven't been is just because, we try not to repeat bands too much. But I mean, we are getting to a point where we're going to kind of have to, just because there's a lot of essential listening, and we just named a lot of essential albums that we have not talked about yet. I mean, we've only done one Angra album, and we're kind of getting that point now where we're starting to kind of, at least in the back of my mind, it's kind of time to kind of go back to bands that we've talked about before, just because, again, like I think you had said last week, like how have we gone, over 125 episodes and not talked about Land of the Free, like this unbelievable landmark in power metal in the 90s during this golden era, which, I mean, to be like one of the most respected and remembered albums during a time period where a lot of classic albums were coming out, I mean, that says a lot about it, in my opinion.
No argument from me. And, I had mentioned how this kind of was a transitional album. Heading for Tomorrow has a very, very long and epic title track on that album, Heading for Tomorrow. But this album kicks off in a way that, quite frankly, maybe the best opening power metal song of all time. And I would argue easily one of, if not the best power metal song of all time in Rebellion in Dreamland. And I'll say this about it. I remember getting a VHS tape off of eBay 25 years ago where I just kind of wanted to watch some music videos because this was pre-YouTube. And all of a sudden, and I was familiar with Gamma Ray. I was a huge fan of this album, but there was a video of Rebellion in Dreamland on this VHS cassette. And the problem with it is, A, very, very cheesy, but aside from that, they cut up this epic song and shaved about 4 minutes off of it. And I hated this edited version of the video, even though I still have the VHS cassette, because it just took all the wonderful things about this opening track and just completely decimated it, in my opinion. But I'll flip the script a little bit. I remember being in New York City at the Gramercy Theater back in January of 2011, which was the last time I saw this band live. It's just crazy. It's been over a decade. And they played Rebellion in Dreamland in its entirety, as they often do at their shows. And I just remember saying to myself, I don't know for my money if there's a better power metal track than this one as they were playing it. It is just the quintessential epic power metal tune. I love it. And I'm not going to go note for note. I'm just going to say that there's not an element here that I didn't enjoy about this song. And even going back to it now this week, it holds up. And Kai Hansen's improvement in the vocal department is on full display. This is not your Walls of Jericho Kai Hansen. This is Kai Hansen as a real frontman of a band. I don't know what else I can say. This is Gamma Ray, this song right here.
What a difference 10 years makes, right?
It's unbelievable.
We talked about Walls of Jericho. It was our second ever episode, which was your first pick, which was, I thought, such an interesting choice for a Halloween album, just because it was where it all began, and the one album that Kai was a vocalist on for 10 years. I believe he did sing at least one full song on one of the 3 Ralph Sheepers Gamma Ray albums, but and he has very prominent backing vocals if you ever listen to the live stuff during the first 3 album era. Kai's voice is just it permeates. But this, I can't imagine what like the fans were thinking at the time, where, I guess kind of around the same time you have like Timo Kotipelto taking over as the singer for Stratovarius and Andy Darris becoming singer for Halloween. And now these bands that have a strong following are changing their, the whole front tone of the album. Like the first thing you hear is this voice. And I know there are people that don't like Kai Hansen's voice. I think particularly of our mutual friend Zod, who wrote on a message board once, I would rather listen to cats getting tortured or something to that effect than to listen to Kai Hansen sing. Something to
strong words.
Something about screeching cats. So needless to say, his voice isn't for everyone, but I liked it immediately when I heard this, and it was kind of funny too, because like parallel to Halloween, you kind of went from like a smoother, more polished singer to like a raspier kind of more maybe guttural is probably not the right word, but just a little more earthy, a little more raspy, a little more gritty. Gritty probably is the right word there. And it really worked for both bands, and I think it really revitalized both bands as well. Instead of, I always look at Van Halen as the perfect example of not trying to find somebody that's a copycat of the old singer and try to move on in a different direction, keep the same tenets and vibe of the band, but have a different voice, so that you're not saying, oh, he's just a copycat or a facsimile of David Lee Roth, kind of what I think we've mentioned in passing, Journey, how their current vocalist, is a Steve Perry, copy.
Right.
And, and I think for a band like Journey that works, that's fine. To me, it's like more interesting. I'd be more interested to hear what, Jeff Scott Soto sounded like when he sang for Journey, just a totally different vibe. So I think that's kind of what, Gamma Ray was going for here. Ralph Sheeper's excellent vocalist, and I think he really found his way with Primal Fear, which is a band that appears to have outlived Gamma Ray, because Gamma Ray seems to be if the band is over, if the band's not over, I should say, then they're definitely on a pretty long hiatus, because Kai is back with Helloween, and it seemed as if even before that he was kind of taking a step back from being the lead vocalist, because they had brought on another another vocalist to kind of help out, which was really interesting, and I don't know that I loved that, because to me, like,
I remember being at your place and watching that anniversary show with him singing, and like, I don't know, it just didn't feel right. I wasn't totally enthralled by the performance. I don't know, something about it. And again, they had been on a bit of a decline for many years at this point. So when they were playing a lot of the newer material, I just didn't care. But this incarnation of the band and what would follow was obviously really what drew me to them. Would you put this song up there with any power metal song, or is it one of your favorites, or is it just, do you think it's slightly overrated?
No, I think it's rated just as it should be. It was never my favorite song on the album, only because I tend to gravitate towards the more faster, aggressive songs, which the very next song we'll discuss. But as far as like a song that has that kind of just mid-tempo kind of march to it, I mean, I don't know that there's anything better than this as far as that style. It's 8+ minutes long. It just builds and builds and builds. It's so epic.
And that bridge is maybe my favorite power metal bridge of all time. How it just speeds up for a second and goes into this ridiculous guitar solo. I love it. And then it calms back down, but in an epic type of way. Quite frankly, I'm not choosing it as my song of the week, but if you've never heard it, stop listening to this episode and go listen to Rebellion in Dreamland, because it's that good. Yeah.
And again, like, talking about our friend Nick, like, I just remember how much he absolutely adored this song, and I'm sure he still does. And when he listens to this episode in a couple of months, I'm sure, he'll appreciate the shout out, and I'm sure he'll be happy to revisit this album.
To be fair, he's been very, very busy working on the Use Your Illusion Guns N' Roses reissue. So I'll just dangle that out there. We have not discussed Guns N' Roses. We should probably have him on to discuss what he did with this new reissue, because it's absolutely fascinating to me. But shout out to Nick. I'm sure you'll enjoy the episode, probably 2023 or beyond. But we appreciate it, and we think
we might be seeing him before he actually even hears this. So
there's no doubt in my mind about that. But if you're gonna follow up an epic opening track, there was only one way to do it, and that was with like a blistering fast power metal tune, which I'm gonna give you the floor, because I have a feeling. I don't have a feeling. I know you love this song, Man on a Mission.
Yeah. So this was like, when I first heard this album, this is a song that just punched me in the face with a handful of bricks. I remember thinking to myself, like, damn, like, this is why Pat wanted me to listen to this. Like, this is just what it's all about. This is what fast-paced, just ass-kicking power metal is all about. It's Kai Hansen just at his very best as a songwriter, as a guitarist, as a vocalist. It's just so addicting. You just hear it and you just want to hear it again and again and again. And when I first heard this album, this was without a doubt my favorite song. Not going to be my song of the week though. But I will probably choose it as the intro to the episode, as an excuse to just to hear another 30 seconds of it. But I mean, this is just an unbelievable tune, and that just, I think it's going to go down as, like, to me, one of the iconic power metal anthems. Just an unbelievable song, and one of my favorites, and I never ever get tired of hearing it, and I always counted, like, the little 50-second fairy tale part as kind of like a little like an outro, because it sounds like stylistically like it should be part of Man on a Mission. So like I always consider it like one combined song. Like, it's weird to me to hear one without the other.
It's a postscript, no question about it. And I'll just say this about Man on a Mission. To me, this is Kai's songwriting on full display, and what makes him a genius. This is the gamma ray sound from this era and for the next 4 or 5 years going forward. I love how they have this epic chorus and how the music drops out, but Kai kind of keeps singing even though the music drops out, and then the band kicks back in. It's just so well done. That song is one of a handful of 10 out of 10s on this album. Obviously, Rebellion, Man on a Mission, and then, again, Fairy Tale, this really epic, fast, heavy postscript song. Maybe one of the best interludes you'll ever hear on an album where there's actually multiple songs that are like this, which kind of bridge the gap between tracks. I actually found the placement of Fairy Tale to be brilliant, because you need something to kind of transition into All of the Damned, which is a very, very different kind of song. And that Fairy Tale segue really does that. All of the Damned is very different. It's got a really cool bass intro, which is something you don't really hear much on this album. And it's very slow, almost Doom-like in a way. The chorus kind of picks up after these very simple verses, but the bass is really what shines on this entire track for me. And it's a song that's kind of grown on me over time. I don't put it in the league of those first two tracks. This is more of like a second tier song, but there's a lot packed into this 5 minutes. And I think that it's for those that are not familiar with the band, there's a lot going on here for a power metal band.
So when I first, heard this album and really listened to it a lot, I always kind of felt like the middle of the album was a little bit underwhelming because the beginning and the end were so strong.
Sure.
And my favorite songs were always at the beginning and the end. And so I was curious how I was going to feel about these middle songs, All the Damned, Gods of Deliverance, Farewell, Salvation's Calling. Those, especially those middle tracks before you kick into like Land of the Free and Abyss of the Void. This was probably my favorite of those middle tracks. I love how, like you said, it kind of comes in with this kind of like slow or mid-paced bass solo, and then 30 seconds in, like the electric guitars kick in, and then you're off to the races. And it's a very different song stylistically. Although, I mean, the first two songs sound nothing alike, and they're like absolute classics. And then this is another song, and again, these are all penned by Kai up until this point. It won't be until Gods of Deliverance that we'll have a song that wasn't written by Kai on this album. But, I thought this was a nice song. Like you said, it's a tier below those first two, which are like God tier. So it's not like, this song is no slouch, but this is a really good song, and I think that I've enjoyed it more as time's gone by, just because it probably didn't suffer from overplayment,
I completely agree with you. It's gotten better with time, and this is, if you would have asked me 25 years ago, I would have said it's one of the weaker tracks on the album. Now I would put it in the upper middle tier, if that makes sense, on the album. And then they go right into Rising of the Damned, which is their second interlude in 5 tracks, which is kind of amazing the way they're structuring this. Very, very heavy orchestration. I don't know that it was necessary. I don't know that they didn't just need to go right into Gods of Deliverance here, but they did, and they decided to kind of stick it in there. But interesting the way this album flows. And then Gods of Deliverance, instead of starting off with the bass solo, you start off with this drum solo, kind of a standard riff. But what's always kind of jumped out to me is that Gods of Deliverance sounds to me like it actually belongs on Somewhere Out in Space. I think that it's a song that really doesn't grab me as much as some of the others on this album, but I wonder if it was like the last song that was recorded and that they went into the studio, they put it in the album, and that like they started churning out the ideas for Somewhere Out in Space shortly thereafter, because again, it belongs, in my opinion, on that album. What I will say about it, though, is that the highlight for me, the second half of this song is so different from the first, and it really takes off in terms of the speed and the way that it kind of mixes the whole song off. It's really like two songs in one in that respect. It picks up, and it's good. I don't know that it's my favorite for sure, but you can see a transition in the sound here.
Yeah, I always thought the bridge was better than the chorus. I thought the chorus was kind of pedestrian on this track. It's so interesting. I'm so glad you mentioned the drums opening, because it's amazing to me that it's a different drummer, because the beginning of Somewhere Out in Space with I'm blanking on was it Anywhere in the Galaxy? No, that's Power Plant. I'm blanking on the first track, but it opens with that with like the drum like that. It sounds like it's the same drum. Maybe it's the same drum kit. I don't know, but it sounds so similar to what Dan Zimmerman would do on the next album. So yeah, I'm totally with you on that. And it's funny, the song was written by Jan Rubach, and this was his last appearance on the album. He, as I mentioned before, he was the bass player. I put this a shade underneath All of the Damned. I think it's another really solid song, if not unspectacular. But good. It fits the mood of the album, and it kind of keeps that flow going of like all these great power metal songs, but none of which sound alike. It's very varied up to
and it would continue with the next track, Farewell, which is the first ballad on the album. Let's hear your thoughts on that, because this is a very different track, just the same as the others.
Yeah, this is again another song that was not written by Kai. This was Dirk wrote this one, and it's kind of it's ballady and then it's not. Because for whatever reason, and I when I first heard this song, I thought that the whole like interlude with Hansi was so out of left field, and I didn't know Blind Guardian at the time, so I'm like, who the hell is this marble-mouthed guy who just comes in and starts, like singing on this song? Because the song's a really, really nice ballad, and then it just kind of like goes to this part where it just like it like the song just gets derailed because, and then this is nothing about this has nothing to do with Hansi at all. The style of the music of the part where Hansi starts singing is like a complete departure from the rest of the song. It's so odd. But overall, the ballad part that makes up 85% of the song is an excellent, excellent ballad. And I'm going to talk more about Gamma Ray's softer side a bit later on. But this is kind of an example of the band having, the ability to write a really good softer tune. But then like, it's just so weird. It goes into like this, like Lord of the Rings kind of like jig kind of with, and then Hansi just comes in out of nowhere. Like, it's like they happen to be in the studio that day at the same time, and they're like, "Hey, Hansi, you want to be on a song?" Like, it's weird.
There's an instrumental section of this song which almost sounds like a waltz, and like
right.
it's all over the place. I
felt like I was in the library in Symphony of the Night.
Yeah. Which great song, by the way. But like it's kind of, they're throwing a lot against the wall here, but for some reason I have grown to like it. I don't know why, and maybe it's because I'm a Blind Guardian fan, but I compare this hodgepodge of stuff to the next song, and it's so much better. Salvation's Calling, to me, really, really heavy riff kicks this thing off. This song has never been my favorite. I think it's probably because I don't enjoy the chorus that much. The verses are fine, but like worst song on the album. It's buried in the middle, and it's what keeps this from being close to a 10. I mean, it's going to be close to a 10, but it's not a 10 because Salvation's Calling kind of sucks, and I'm just not into it.
You want to hear something funny?
It's your song of the week.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't even on my phone when I was listening to this on the plane. It went from Farewell to Land of the Free, and it was jarring to me, and I couldn't figure out why. And now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, shit! Like this song was. So the way that the phone is set up is that the songs that go onto my phone are based on how many times I've played them, and because I just can't fit my entire library of songs onto my phone, so I have to curate it somehow. And the easiest way to do that is to just say, if this song has been played in my iTunes more than 3 or 4, whatever it is, times, it goes onto the phone. This was the one song on the entire album that just wasn't on my phone, and I didn't even notice it was missing. I mean,
because
how sad
it sucks. It's terrible. It's not a good song. It's like
it's fine. I don't think it sucks, but listen, I agree. It's the worst song on the album.
I was comparing this album to other albums that were coming out at the same time. The reason Angels Cry is a better album, despite Rebellion and Dreamland, is because Salvation's Calling just brings it down a little bit, and there is no weak link on Return to Heaven Denied or Angels Cry or Holy Land. This, not for my money, you could have had a better album if you just didn't have this track on there. Because
I mean, for comparison's sake, I gave Angels Cry a 10 because there are no weak spots on that entire album. Every song is great. This album, it's not the same. Like every song is at least, if you don't count this song, every song is at least very good. And the classics will pull that score up.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I'll say it too. Like this isn't going to be a 10 for me. I again, like, just forgot about the song. It's fine. It's an average song. This was written by Jan Rubach as well. He had 3 songwriting credits, and it turns out that those 3 songs are 3 of my least favorite songs on the album. So, say maybe that has something to do with my increased interest in the band going forward, because the songs would, obviously he wouldn't have any songwriting credits because he wasn't in the band anymore. But I mean, I also think that this is kind of well placed because it kind of gives you a little break. You just saw that like haphazard ballad that was, which by the way, like it goes right back to being a ballad again with like a 90 seconds left to go after the whole jig meets waltz, bard song. And then it almost is like perfect because it kind of like lowers your guard a little bit before Land of the Free just comes in and just smashes you. Like I think it makes for a good. I think it was well placed. If there was a positive comment to be made, it was well placed.
Well, it was well placed, and it makes Land
not as well placed as being left off completely, but well placed nevertheless.
I agree. Land of the Free is another absolutely perfect song and another testament to Kai's songwriting. The verses are a bit spooky in a way, but the chorus is just absolutely lights out. It is a perfect live song, and you hear Michael Kiske and Hansi Kirsch doing backing vocals, which, I mean, why they're not front and center is another question, but long story short, you can clearly hear Michael Kiske in these background vocals, and it was really his first metal appearance since Keeper, all right, Kids of the Century maybe, certainly not Chameleon, but like he was doing metal again, and it was great to hear. And obviously we'll get to another appearance by him shortly. But this is an A+ tune. It's just an absolute classic, and I think you'd be hard pressed to not enjoy this one.
Yeah, I believe this album came out before Kiske's first solo album, Instant Clarity. This is off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that album came out the following year. So yeah, this was kind of like the first time hearing, and it kind of makes you wonder. I know there was like all those rumors that, Kiske could be the next singer for Iron Maiden, which would have been so weird, but yet I think it would have worked somehow. But But I always wondered why the hell Kiss, and I mean, I guess it's not that unusual considering Kiss' distaste for metal at this time, but Jesus, if he became the singer for Gamma Ray at this time, I mean, I don't know, it would have been a totally different kind of band, and maybe it would have been too much like the Keeper era of Helloween, and maybe Gamma Ray needed to have Kai to kind of set it apart. But I remember thinking at the time, like, and especially when we get to Time to Break Free, like, holy shit, like, what would this band have been like if Kiss was the singer?
I think that's a fair question, and we'll get to it momentarily. The Savior is another interlude song, and serves as an intro to Abyss of the Void. Is, for my money, Rebellion, Man on a Mission, Land of the Free. Those are the 3 A+10 classic tracks on the album. But Abyss of the Void is the 4th gem. It's the forgotten gem on this album. And to be honest with you, it's a live favorite. They played it back in 2011 when we saw them. This is the forgotten track that nobody talks about, but they should be talking about. And I'll make it my song of the week as a result. Let's give it a listen. I just love how this song starts off so slow and begins to pick up. It's heavy, it's catchy. It's probably the darkest song on the album. I love how the keyboards just pop in certain spots, which I thought was a really nice touch. And it's just a really tight number that has grown on me more than any other. There were tracks on here that I've loved forever, but this one is the one that has grown on me more than any other.
I made it a kind of a habit when I first got iTunes on my computer and I was starting to rip my CD collection into digital. iTunes had this really great feature that you could join tracks into one. If you wanted to take, for instance, I joined the entire Pleasant Shade of Grey album as one full track because as we discussed, I never wanted to hear just a part of it. I wanted to hear the whole thing, which ultimately led me to never listen to it at all. But, I always thought specifically of songs like Warrior of Ice by Rhapsody from their first album, how I couldn't listen to it without that 1.5-minute intro to lead into it because it just wasn't the song. And so when I ripped this album, I had to attach Fairy Tale to the end of Man on a Mission. I had to attach Rising of the Damned to the end of All of the Damned. And The Savior has to be at the beginning of Abyss of the Void for me because the song, if you just listen to Abyss of the Void, it sounds like you missed something. Like it's starting and it's like, did this start already? And it's like, well, it kind of did. But also The Savior is kind of also the end of Land of the Free. It kind of acts as like more of a segue than an intro. But to me, like it's essentially part of this song. And it's also my song of the week. So it's just, to me, I agree with you. I feel like the 3 songs you mentioned were always like the 3 staples of the live set from this album. And this was kind of the classic outside looking in, the 4th, redheaded stepchild, where it's better than every song on the album, every other song on the album. But like, it didn't always get played. And you mentioned that January 2011 show, which I gotta think that it only happened because they did 70,000 tons that year and they just were back in the States, and it just made sense for them to do a handful of shows. And I'm so grateful because they haven't done a US tour since then, and we haven't seen them live since then. And I remember that they played this and it made me so happy. It was the highlight of that set for me, was to hear this song, because I always just thought it was always one of my favorite songs. It still is. And listening to it on the plane, I just had goosebumps. I was reading the lyrics, and like the lyrics are so just ass kicking. It's just like, whether you want to like attach religious connotations to it, or even just like in a fantasy world and slay the evil, whatever. It's just so epic, and I would argue that it probably should have been the last track on the album. I think that Afterlife, while it was it was dedicated to Ingo Schwichtenberg, who had passed away pretty shortly before this album was released. It's kind of, I think it's a little bit of an underwhelming way to end the album when you have this track that could have been, you could have had the perfect beginning in Rebellion in Dreamland and a perfect end with Abyss of the Void. But then almost, if you actually, in all honesty, I would have taken Land of the Free, The Savior, and Abyss of the Void and just pushed all those three tracks right to the end.
I think there's an argument to be made there. Just skipping around a bit, because you mentioned Afterlife. It's a dark closing tune. Has a bit of a Blind Guardian feel to it in many ways, and a touch of prog. It's almost proggy the way that they structure it. It's never been my favorite song, and I feel like it would have been better served. Yeah, Abyss of the Void should have been the last track. Maybe. I feel like Abyss of the Void and even Time to Break Free, which we'll talk about as the last track. That stuff was so strong that Afterlife was a bit of a letdown when, at the end of the album, just in terms of, my personal preference. But if you would have pushed those three songs you mentioned towards the back, I think it would have solidified the back end, because Time to Break Free, which I'll get into now, is just a bit different than the rest of the songs here. It doesn't sound like anything else on the album, but it was the return of the mighty Michael Kiske, right? And here he is doing this catchy, simple metal tune that was like worth the price of admission just to hear him doing vocals again. And although the song doesn't fit the album, it's fine. It's so good to hear him sing, and he sounds almost happy in a way. It's like there's something just so lively about this track. I love it. And then there's this guitar noodling towards the end of the song, which reminds me of the goofiness of like a Rise and Fall. There's just something so charming about it that I love it, even though I would never say it's the best track that Kai ever penned. And then to go into Afterlife is kind of a letdown, in my opinion.
Yeah, it was so good to hear. Funny enough, like we probably heard Keeper of the Seven Keys for the first time like the year before we heard Land of the Free, but like sure. In retrospect, when you think about like that, I mean, it was 2 years after Chameleon. I mean, I think it was a time where people didn't really know what he was going to do, and so this was kind of a taste of like, he's still around, he's still got it. It's a really good song. It's one of my favorite of the mid-tier songs on the album. I think Gamma Ray's last DVD Blu-ray release, Kiss comes out and they actually play this song, which I thought was so cool because like, who the hell remembers this song, honestly? Like it kind of got forgotten amongst those big four that we just talked about. But it's such a fun little tune, and I thought it was so fun watching the DVD. Kiske has the lyrics written on a sheet of paper because he probably hadn't sung the song since they recorded it in the studio,
yeah.
And I think they also maybe did like I Want Out or A Future World or maybe both. It was kind of this little preview of what was to come eventually in Unisonic, and then, ultimately now with the Halloween reunion. I think that Kai and Waiki both understood what the fans wanted, and it took a little bit of nudging for Kiske to kind of get back on board. And I think now that he is, I think that he knew it was the right call. And I bet I'd be willing to bet he doesn't have any regrets for how he did anything, but also now, like, he's kind of back where he belongs. And I think that that's what people wanted. And I think that's great. Like, you gave the fans, I remember even in those early years of becoming a fan of these bands, like, that's all I ever really wanted, was to be able to see all these guys on stage together again. And we got a little taste of that when Gamma Ray opened for Halloween, and at the end of the show, all the Gamma Ray guys came out and they played some of those old Halloween songs with Halloween, and having, like, just seeing Kai on stage with Waiki and Marcus and everything was so mind-boggling. But who would have guessed, like, what we would see today? But yeah, like, Afterlife, again, that's the third track that Jan Rubach wrote, and it's like I said, it's kind of it was dedicated to Ingo, who took his own life, sadly. But it's just so I can understand why that would be chosen as the last song, but it's just, to me, it's just an okay song. It's one of my least favorites on the album, to be totally honest. And it just kind of ended the album in a bit of a kind of a lackluster kind of way, if you're not going to talk about, like, bonus tracks and stuff. But these 13 tracks kind of make up the album proper, and we always talk about track orders and stuff, and I just really feel like this album really would have benefited from taking those 3 tracks, Land of the Free, The Savior, Abyss of the Void, and just putting them at the end. And I think that Afterlife would have made for a good segue between Time to Break Free and Land of the Free, because they're both, like, pretty upbeat songs, so you want to have something a little less upbeat, kind of breaking that up. I think that would have worked. Otherwise, I think the album was really well paced. Other than that, like I said, it kind of has, like, a dip in the middle, and then a kind of a little bit of a dip at the end too.
I agree with all that, and then you had alluded to the fact that there are bonus tracks. The album was reissued a couple of times, if I'm not mistaken. You want to say a few words about those before we rate this thing and wrap up our discussion?
Yeah, oddly enough, I think we had mentioned more than once. I think we talked about. We never did an episode on Stratovarius's Visions album, but we talked. I remember mentioning about Conception's Parallel Minds, and just Noise Records had a history of giving you liner notes that did not match what was on your disc.
Absolutely correct.
This was one of those albums where in the liner notes I had lyrics for Heavy Metal Mania, and I was wondering, where the hell is this song? It's not on this track. And I think Noise Records had a habit of like copying the liner notes from, like, their like from other regions' albums, and then adding them into, because my disc only had the 13 tracks. There were no bonus tracks, but yet I would have liner notes showing. And the same thing with Conception had was it a Black on Black in the liner notes, but wasn't on the disc. I had a copy of Visions where the liner notes said Kiss of Judas as track 1 and Black Diamond as track 2. But when I put the disc in, Black Diamond was track 1 and Kiss of Judas was track 2, which I believe was the Japanese track listing. And then sure enough, after Visions, the song ended, there were 2 more tracks on the album that weren't even listed. I think they might have accidentally, like, pressed the Japanese version and sold it domestically. And so, like, that's one of my prized discs that I still have, is this, like, accidental bonus track edition. So this was the opposite. I got this one where
shafted here.
The liner notes promised more than the album could deliver.
Listen, I don't think you're missing all that much, to be completely honest with you. Heavy Metal Mania is a Holocaust cover. They're a Scottish metal band. It's okay. It doesn't really grab me. There's a
it's funny. I feel like even though this is a cover, I feel like this kind of became kind of like their like heavy metal anthem when they would do live shows in the 90s, until like Power Plant came out, and then they came out with their own what was it, Heavy Metal
Universe, which honestly is my least favorite song on Power Plant, but that's for another day.
Yeah, that was I always felt like that was Gamma Ray's attempt at being Manowar.
Yeah, and I just have no interest.
I always thought Heavy Metal Mania was kind of a better song, even though it was a cover, and I kind of I like that the lyrics, like it's just like that typical 90s metal where it's just like you're telling people that this is metal and you're going to listen to it and you're going to like it, and it's like it's kind of like you're convincing all your friends who have no idea what the hell you've been listening to for the last few years, like, no, asshole, heavy metal, listen to it, you're gonna love it. And then the other tracks were, I think, just remakes of songs that they did during the Ralph Sheepers era, As Time Goes By and The Silence, which I go back and listen to the Silent Miracles EP, which came out the following year, because I feel like themes on this that kind of felt almost like this was like a sequel to Land of the Free. Miracle is the 7-minute track that is almost like this slowed up version of Man on a Mission. Jesus, original version of Jesus Saves, where it's kind of a mid-tempo, like totally different vibe of a song. There's 4 tracks on this EP, and they're all kind of mellow. It's kind of like the lighter side of Gamma Ray. The track 2 is just they added Farewell onto this to kind of keep with that motif of kind of mellow songs. The Silence is the last 2 songs of The Silence and A While in Dreamland. I love these songs. These could have been the last 2 songs on Land of the Free. I don't know if I don't know if A While in Dreamland existed yet, but The Silence was just a re-recorded version of a song from an earlier Gamma Ray album that they did with it's actually from Heading for Tomorrow, the original first album. It just kind of starts out like this epic way, and then it goes into like this kind of piano-y, like much like these last 2 tracks have piano in them. You didn't hear any of that on Land of the Free. Silence is a really nice song, very epic. A While in Dreamland is in my opinion the best Gamma Ray ballad of all time, and probably a lot of people don't really know it that well, but it's really just Kai and a piano and some whistling towards the end. I love this song. I think it's so beautiful. Gamma Ray was never, I think, as good at writing ballads as Helloween was over the years, but
I agree.
This song is, I think, an absolute beauty, and I just thought it deserved mentioning.
I'm glad you did, because we probably were never going to get to it otherwise. So, good recap. But if you just look at those first 13 tracks, the main crux of this album, how does it rate for you? And does it eclipse the Somewhere Out in Space 9.375?
It's a hard call. I think that when we talked about Somewhere Out in Space, we had kind of some similar thoughts, as there were some songs that kind of dragged it down a little bit, like, because there are so many really classic, amazing songs on Somewhere Out in Space, but then, stuff like Lost in the Future kind of dragged it down a little bit.
Sure.
I'm going to put this one, it's so hard because, like, you have Rebellion and Man on a Mission and Abyss of the Void and Land of the Free that are like maybe 4 of the best Gamma Ray songs ever, not to mention 4 of the best power metal songs ever. And they're kind of holding this album up. I don't know though, like in retrospect, if I think that this album is as good overall as Somewhere Out in Space, which I'm kind of surprised to hear myself say out loud. So I'm going to give it a 9.
Okay.
It's a 9 for me. It's definitely royalty. But when I'm just looking at the track list for Somewhere Out in Space, and I'm like, there's really only one song that I don't love on that entire album. Maybe 9.375 was too low for Somewhere Out in Space, but I digress. I am going to rank it slightly underneath. Now the question is, where does Power Plant land? With in comparison to these two, and I'm sure that's something we'll discuss, probably next year, if I had to put a very vague guess as to when that would be. But I feel pretty comfortable just giving it it's a very good score. It's just that some of those Jan Rubach tracks, they kind of drag it down a little bit. I mean, everything else kind of pulls it right back up to that 9.
I think I'm going to give it a 9 as well, which is a touch above Somewhere Out in Space. I think Somewhere Out in Space is the more complete album from top to bottom. Very few dead spots. Just a really solid release. But even though there's a little bit less traction with maybe 2, maybe 3 of these tracks, the top end is just so perfect, so iconic, and amongst some of the best songs of all time that it almost acts as like the opposite of an anchor, pulling it up, right? Like a magnet, just pulling this up a touch. But listen, the reality is this. I think I actually listened to Somewhere Out in Space more than I listened to this album at this point, because from beginning to end, it's just a beautiful listen throughout. But neck and neck, depending on the day, I think you can go either way. And I look forward to eventually discussing Power Plant to round out the trilogy. So there you go. Land of the Free.
I mean, I mean, God, I could, when it comes to this stuff, I just can't stop talking. But, to me, like, I remember you had mentioned that, like, All of the Damned was kind of like that second tier of this album.
Yeah. And
to me, going back to, Somewhere Out in Space, the second tier for me had songs like The Guardians of Mankind and No Stranger. And I think those were better songs. So I think the second tier on Somewhere Out in Space was better than on Land of the Free. And so maybe that's kind of why I push it a little higher. I also think Shine On was a much better last song. And I think that matters. I think order matters. Like, this was, an album that could have been ordered better. So yeah, I'm being nitpicky for, picking things wrong with an album that's essentially a 9, but, I just, looking back on it, and I don't think I think if we never did this podcast, I probably would say Land of the Free was a better album, but when you look at things with a more, I don't know what the word. Yeah, like really just dig into it and kind of look at things as more of a whole than what's the old saying, like the parts of a whole or whatever. Like, is it bigger? Is it better than the sum of its parts? And I think that in this case, like for me, Somewhere Out in Space is better. Just as a small preview to the eventual Power Plant episode, like they're. I will say Short as Hell is probably one of my least favorite Gamma Ray songs of those 3 albums. And Heavy Metal Universe is also kind of on that list of songs I don't love from that era. So, but looking at the rest of that track list, every song is a banger. So like, it'll be interesting to see how I feel. And also, speaking of ordering, those 2 songs that I think are 2 of the weaker Gamma Ray songs are kind of stuck in the middle of the album where they belong. Mm-hmm. So maybe they learned a little something about ordering stuff, but, and just, briefly, just to kind of tie a bow on it, the band re-recorded Rebellion in Dreamland, Man on a Mission, and Land of the Free for the Blast from the Past album. I never really found that they sounded terribly different, considering it was 5 years later and the band. You have a different drummer and a different guitar player, but it's still Kai. So they sounded fairly similar to me, whereas those 11 or 10 tracks that were redone from the Ralph Scheepers era, hearing them with a modern production with Kai singing, the Rich and Famous bonus track is a highlight for me. I love Last Before the Storm. I think the Kai version of Last Before the Storm is one of the best Gamma Ray songs. Heaven Can Wait, as I mentioned before. Lust for Life. There's a lot of really good tunes, and if you just don't want to listen to the first 3 albums like I didn't for years, you can just grab this and kind of it's kind of like a greatest hits of the pre-Land of the Free era. So that's my long-winded bow on this album that I clearly have a lot of thoughts about.
Well, I love it. Just a couple of news items before I pick out my album for next week. Firewind, another band we've kind of mentioned from here and there on the podcast. They're going into the studio. They're planning on releasing their new album next year. I don't even think I knew this, but Herbie Langens is, I think, the vocalist for Firewind now. They've had quite the run of singers with Apollo and now Herbie, so that'll be interesting. They're a band that I feel like I like, but I would never say that I love the band, but I'm kind of curious to hear what the new album sounds like. And then in tour news, Jeff Tate is going back out on tour next year to do the 35th anniversary of Operation Mindcrime. Now, I've seen them do it with Queensryche. I've seen him do it solo, and I am an absolute sucker for the album. So if he comes back and does it stateside again, I will pony up my $50 and go see them again. So that is something else to look forward to. And I got one other piece of news, which I'll get to shortly because it's actually going to lead into well, you know what? I'll just bury the lead now. TNT is getting back together, and I nearly selected this band as the band I wanted to choose next week, but I won't. And that's Tony Harnell on vocals with a couple of the classic TNT guys. I don't know how familiar you are with this band, but basically it is like a Norwegian band that started in the mid to late 80s, released a bunch of albums, and I feel like they were the precursor to a lot of the Norwegian sound that we hear now for that melodic metal stuff. Really, really interesting band. I can't say that that I know that much of the back catalog, but I have to say, I was this close to picking them, but I'm going to choose something else. But we will be doing a TNT album soon because I think Tony Harnell is one of the most underrated vocalists out there.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar with them other than them airing Monday Nitro for several years. So yeah. I'm gonna pick out a couple of headlines, and I'm kind of gonna have one that I know that you'll get into a bit. So here we go. So. Paul Di'Anno explains why he once compared Steve Harris to Hitler.
Not touching that. I'm not really sure. I mean, we've seen so many bad analogies as of late. I just can't put my head around that one. And I think Paul Di'Anno has a number of issues from what I understand. So we'll just leave that out there.
Yeah. Former Children of Bodom members are officially launching a bar and band museum.
Where can I go? I'm assuming it's in Finland, but that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, so here's, I'm sure you're going to have some thoughts on this as you are planning on attending the 70,000 Tons of Metal cruise, but they have added Evergrey to the lineup amongst a handful of other bands, bringing the total up to 16 of 60 thus far. Some thoughts on Evergrey and some of the other bands that have been added since last we spoke.
I am... As someone that didn't think there was going to be a cruise this year, they are now announcing about a band every day, kind of fast and furiously, and it's really, really exciting to me. As the lineup takes shape, it's overwhelming. But I'm excited to see Evergrey. It's always a good show. I don't know that I'm going to go catch both of their sets, but we'll see what time they're playing. But they've announced a number of bands that have caught my interest over the last kind of week and a half. Evergrey is obviously a band I enjoy. I've never seen Fallujah live. I feel like that'll be a really interesting show. Creator is always a fantastic live band. They announced the French power metal band Nightmare. I'm not a huge fan, but I may pop in for their set. I thought of you when they announced Corpiclani. I am not a fan, but I know that you enjoy some of their stuff. I feel like that'll be a kick live. And Oceans of Slumber, which is a nice addition. I didn't catch their last tour, but I'm going to make a point of seeing their set on the boat just because I like them. They've announced
what better band than a band with oceans in its name to be playing on a cruise ship?
On the ocean. I mean, you can't make it up, but the fact that they have 44 bands left to announce is just mind-boggling to me, but it's going to be a fun couple of weeks, and I'm sure we'll get into more of them as they announce them in the coming weeks.
Yeah. Corpiclani is like one of those bands where I don't know that I would ever go out of my way to go see them live. But if they were on like a cruise ship like that, like I would absolutely go see them. Just like they're that kind of band for me. So that is pretty cool that they were added. I think they've played on the cruise a number of times thus far, and I'm sure that they're probably a fan favorite.
I would think so at this point.
I've always gotten the impression that their live shows always just look like a lot of freaking fun.
Yeah, and I don't think they take themselves too seriously and that sort of a thing. So if the timing works out, I'll drop in, I'll take some pictures, and I'll send you a video or two, but it should be fun.
Yeah. So what else do we have here? You know what? I did want to mention this because I believe it did. I know we talked a bit about Judas Priest going to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Did it happen though? Last we talked, because so the event took place, but HBO hasn't aired the footage yet. I believe it's coming out in a week or two. I don't think we talked about the actual ceremony and the performance, but I came across a photo of Rob Halford singing Jolene with Dolly Parton, and thought to myself, what the hell is more metal than that?
It has happened. I did see the photo, and I'm dying to see the performance. Now, I think that many would argue, and I would be probably one of the first to argue, that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is not what I think it was originally envisioned, and maybe that's because in their mind they're running out of artists or big name artists to put in. But Dolly Parton and Rob Halford, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and the video will probably be worth 1,000,000. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah, that is. I don't know. To me, like, just that photo was like, this is so perfect. Like, I think that especially metal fans, there's a lot of derision aimed at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame because, I mean, Iron Maiden's not in it. I mean, so that's enough right there.
That's it. But
I think that it's headed in the right direction. I'm not going to belabor the point because I've mentioned this before, but I also think that like it's still an honor to be honored by your peers and appreciated for what you've done. And I still think that it means enough for these people to show up. And rock and roll, I think, is more of a state of mind than a genre of music. And so I think that when a country star or a hip hop star gets inducted and people get all bent out of shape about it and say, well, it's not rock and roll. It's like, well, a lot of people don't think that heavy metal is a form of rock and roll. So, I think it's more of a state of mind. It's more of, I think they were a boon to the music industry, not so much rock and roll. Again, it's a state of mind. It's not a genre of music. I mean, rock and roll is the broad. If you thought heavy metal was a broad brushstroke for a music genre, rock and roll encompasses to me, it does encompass certain parts of hip hop and country and lots of different, soul and jazz, certain jazz and certain blues. And it really is not just, the Beatles and Bruce Springsteen and that kind of stuff. And as time goes by, you're going to see more, alt rock bands from the 90s and the 2000s. And I think you're going to start seeing kind of like this, it's going to like come back to the Iron Maidens of the world and those kind of bands that, might not have gotten the attention right away. I am a little surprised that Priest would go in before Iron Maiden. But maybe that's just a sign that Maiden's just next on the list. So
that to me is the biggest omission by far, because forget the other people they're admitting. The fact that Iron Maiden is still selling out arenas every time they play and not in is the single biggest indictment against the Hall of Fame. But I'm sure it's only a matter of time.
The Monkees not being in it.
Well, that goes without saying. I figured that was like kind of the baseline, and we go from there. But I wanna talk briefly about the album I chose for next week, and I'm doing it a little bit because of selfishness and a little bit because of timeliness. I have tickets on Friday to go see Armored Saint and Wasp, and I have always wanted to talk about Wasp on the podcast because they're one of my guilty pleasures and a band that I grew up loving when we were in high school, and I don't know why I gravitated towards their sound because they were so kind of off the beaten path and not the biggest band in the world, but I always liked their sound. So I want to go back and talk about their debut album from 1984, which is still a classic in the genre. So we're going to be talking about their self-titled debut album, Wasp. And I think it's just timely because I want to go listen to them in advance of the concert that I'm seeing this week. So I hope you'll enjoy it, and I think you'll get a kick out of some of this stuff.
I hope it's not too waspy.
I think that I definitely don't think you have to worry about. So for those out there that are listening, we appreciate it. We appreciate the love and support. Definitely join us on our social media. We love to engage with you guys, and we see some really interesting posts and whatnot. So keep it coming. Follow us on all the social media platforms, and we will come back next week with some Wasp.
Yeah, that's cool. That's definitely, I think I had mentioned that I literally am only familiar with their Elton John cover of Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, which is a really great cover.
No question about it. I agree with that, but I think it's time you listen to some of their original material, as great as that cover is.
Yeah.
So
I thought you were going to say that we were going to be doing Armored Saint, but I have a feeling that we'll get to them at some point as well.
No doubt about that.
There's just this will be episode 124, and we still have so much that we haven't even touched. So plenty more to come, plenty more to look forward to. But yeah, that's cool. Good choice. Look forward to discussing it, and yeah, I guess I'll have to come up with something else for the following week.
I look forward to it.
Maybe a new power plant.
Enjoy the week, bud. I will talk to you soon. Welcome back.
Thanks, pal. Good to be back.